Hi, my name is Bree and welcome to Bree Reads Books, the place where I read and talk about books. If you're new here, I'm glad you found me. If you are not new, welcome back. We're doing something a little different today. We're talking politics. I have my tea ready so that we can have this conversation. This is a conversation I think you have to have over tea. So I am kind of a perpetual lurker, and I spend a lot of time looking at the ways that people online talk about politics. I find it endlessly fascinating. My master's thesis was on social networks and how they influence the way you learn about politics specifically, and so as you might imagine, I have a lot of thoughts. I have learned over time that it's probably best to keep most of those thoughts to yourself, but I wanted to share some of the things that go into my thinking, and I think you're gonna like it. And so today I kind of want to indulge a little bit of that nerdy side. This is a new series that I'm actually super excited to be starting. I can't promise an upload schedule. I'm aiming for once a month. But we're going to be talking about political theories, political philosophy, and how they inform science fiction. So one of the great things about science fiction that I've always really enjoyed is that science fiction is fundamentally about who people are. Who are they when they're at their best and worst? Who are they if they don't come in a physical body? How do we interact with one another? What is fair? What are we going to be like when we go out into the stars and face these imperialist urges that we've had before? How does our past inform our future, and our potential future inform our present? There's a reason why people like Ursula LeGuin and Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov were drawn to science fiction. And it's because in a lot of ways, science fiction provides us the opportunity to examine fundamental questions about human beings and our nature. So let's start this conversation with some of the very basics. What is political theory, and why does it even matter? At its heart, political theory is a fundamental thing that you already know about. It is a way that you believe the government or the political system should be based upon your ideas of how humans operate. I think at its most basic, you can kind of summarize political theory as the way you see people functioning naturally, what you think people should function like, and how you're going to get there. So let's start with a pretty basic example of this. Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is a very well-known political thinker, and no, he's not just Hobbes from Calvin and Hobbes, though he is the inspiration for the name. Thomas Hobbes is known for one of his fundamental works, called Leviathan. It purports that people at their very base natures are brutish, cold, dangerous, and that if given the chance, any person will harm or do whatever it takes physically to cause another person to give them over resources. Hobbes says that our lives are bound to be very short when left in the wild, that we will kill each other in order to survive, and that if we want to maximize all of our lives and to minimize the kind of pain we're going to go through, people need to band together and create an order. In a sense, all of the people who are weakest in the society need to rise up together to defeat the most naturally powerful. And that banding together eventually creates a system called the state. That state is the Leviathan, the powerful entity that cannot be stopped. Hobbes' theory is based upon that idea of who people are, cold, murderous, brutish, the idea of how we should be, at the very least organized and ordered, and what we should do about it. Create a systematic way of suppressing people's natural, violent urges. Hobbes, though, isn't the only person to put forth a political theory by far, and you may be familiar with some of the others. And I'm going to talk about a couple of others that I also think will be really important for our conversations going forward. First, Aristotle. Aristotle puts forth an idea that humans have a just center. What this essentially really means isn't that we somehow seek justice on behalf of others. It's not that we have a just criminal system or something like that, or that even that we treat each other particularly kindly or compassionately. What he means by justice is that there is a sense of balance within ourselves and one another, and that there is a sense of middle ground that humanity has to find in order to be at its best. If you pick up one of his fundamental works, Nicomachean Ethics, what you're going to read is a lot of him giving us examples of finding this justice. You can be ridiculously brave, or you can be ridiculously cowardly, but neither of them actually does any good. The ridiculously brave get themselves killed and the cowardly do nothing, and so you have to find the middle ground. That's essentially what he says for almost all of our traits. It's the kind of moderation even in moderation philosophy of politics. So that brings us to our next philosophy that we're going to talk about. Democracy as a political thought. See, democracy is based upon a very fundamental idea of human beings that really stems out of a lot of Enlightenment thinking. Essentially, it says that human beings, if given the right tools and the right education, the right knowledge, can come forward to make rational decisions that better everyone. Then we can actually go ahead and kind of crowdsource the best answers. Now, this is with a couple of caveats because, let's face it, democracy is founded in a lot of ideas that are also classist and elitist, that exclude people of color and women, but democracy has grown in the people who it's been inclusive of, and I think its understanding of human nature has more or less stayed the same. And this brings us to one of my favorite questions of the internet. Why can't we just read this as a story? Does everything have to be political? What is wrong with you people? Was that dramatic enough for you? I see this argument happen a lot on the internet, generally with people who are fairly active in either activism circles or political circles, who see a lot of political elements and implications in the stories they read, and people who maybe aren't thinking about that particular side of the story. People who really just kind of want to see guns going off on screen. And I'm gonna go ahead and preface this by saying I think both ways of approaching media are pretty legitimate. And there are definitely times when all of us kind of just want to sit back and watch a shoot 'em up and not really think about the political implications of having like prostitutes in a brothel on the screen too. We just want the Western. But the question that's behind that, is every story political, is a really important one for us to address, because I think it provides us with a conscious way of making the determination of how we're going to consume our media. The core question at the heart of that kind of a conversation is this story political or apolitical? And the answer to that question is always, it's kind of hard to tell, because while not every story has a political intention, every story has a political context. Let's break down what I mean by that. Yes, there are stories like The Handmaid's Tale, stories that are expressly trying to talk to a particular dynamic in our political world, right? You have Ufred, who is being kind of dominated because of her gender. The entire theocracy that is domineering her life has things to say about who she is, how she should act, and has the political means to make that happen. Her fighting that becomes a sort of uprising in and of itself, and her own agency is a political question. Yes, Atwood is expressly political. But then there are other stories, right? The kind of westerns of the world that seem at their face maybe like they're just shoot 'em up stories. I mean, is it really so wrong to just want to read Harry Potter as a kid's story about a bad guy who gets defeated, about really cool magic battles and dragons? Does it have to be political? This again gets at that kind of ambiguity, right? And yes, people in fandom, you can take a seat, sit down. We all know about J.K. Rowling. And for those of us who are seeking that kind of just pure shoot 'em up story where there's nothing wrong, right? Where it's the Indiana Jones of the world and it's just fun fantasy, that's totally fine. But you have to remember that there is a political context in the back of the room. A political context is a broad way of saying that everything is written with some sort of real life thing going on for the author, some sort of structure that is the background for the characters, that informs the story itself. The political context for a story answers questions like, Well, what did Orson Scott Card mean in this? Is there a particular reason why these characters can't get married? Is there a particular reason why we're at war? Why does everyone need to be enlisted in this army? Why is this person even here, and how come their dukedom is influencing where they are in this war and who they're against? All of those background elements go into the political context, and moreover, our real world spills into that. For instance, there's a difference between writing flowers for Algernon in a world where people are institutionalized when they're intellectually disabled, and in writing flowers for Algernon if there are no people with disability in your universe. If I had never had a world where there were no people with disability, I read the story a vastly different way than in a world where I know that there are reports going on, that there are exposés happening about people in asylums and institutions like there would have been around the time Zakis was writing. That is also background context for a story, and is why a lot of people look at a story that seemingly isn't political and sees a political element. In a way, you can kind of look at this as a death of the author's question. Lindsay Ellis has a fantastic entire video about death of the author, but essentially it's really hard to take the author and what the author says out of a story once you know it's there. And once you know what the author was kind of thinking at the time, it does change the way you read things. Again, there's nothing wrong with not wanting to look at the political context of a story, but in a lot of ways you aren't reading the full story itself then. We don't all have the time and mental and emotional energy to come home and do a deep dive on why Hunt for Red October is more than just a submarine story, but that doesn't change the fact that it's actually a Cold War story. And perhaps more importantly, the things that we take for granted within the context of a story are often where we find our flaws and where we find the things that we ought to question. Like I said, science fiction for me is so much fun because it is one of the real ways that we get to play around with a political idea before we ever have to execute it. One of the really big reasons why I love science fiction is because it's a playground for the philosopher. When you are able to create a society that looks like anything, on a world that looks like anything, you can ask yourself big questions without risking offending someone or calling out certain behaviors expressly. You can put people in completely theoretical conversations and imagine what their human nature says about them. And I think that's a really undervalued aspect of literature in general. Science fiction asks us, what are our morals and ethics, and what of those are worth keeping? What are our assumptions, and when are we wrong? When are we willing to be wrong? And when do we need someone to show us? And I think those are really important questions for the world, not just for literature. So over the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to be picking up Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Heinlein is a pretty contentious author, who purports a lot of different things that frankly for me even are pretty confusing. I find him to be simultaneously somebody who makes me very frustrated, but also who occasionally says things that I'm surprised to find myself agreeing with. And I think that that level of contention is a really good place to start for a series like this. I'm picking up A Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and over the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to be tabbing it, making sure that I find all sorts of interesting quotes, and really examining the idea of capitalism and how that interacts with political systems, or lack thereof. I'm gonna go ahead and put in the description box below a couple of the other books I'm looking at using for this series. I'm looking at things that I think question our human nature, that question the way we interact with things, and that really, I think, exemplifies some of the really interesting political thought and questions that we have about who we are as human beings. So tell me what you think about science fiction and politics. Do you think there's a place for talking about politics in science fiction? Do you prefer to just look at your fantasy as, well, just that? A fun story that helps you relax after a long day at work? And what do you think both of those approaches have to offer us? I'm really looking forward to your thoughts, and I'm super excited to go on this adventure with you. I don't think I have been this excited for a project in a really, really long time. If you liked this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I would love to have you along for this kind of thought journey into the future. And if you like what I do and you want to help support me in other places, you can follow me on Twitter and on Instagram, or you can head on over to my Patreon page and you can become a patron. Patrons get exclusive access to videos a day early, and you can help me pick out some of my TBR books. I hope you guys are having a fantastic reading week. Talk to you later.